Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 7. Today we'll discuss going beyond the binary. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to the Project 2 assignment sheet. And with today's lecture assignment, I'm going to ask that you draw a spectrum of perspectives. And there are a couple of ways you can go about doing this. You can either do it digitally, which is what I'm going to demonstrate using Word throughout today's lecture. You're also welcome to use InDesign, Paint, or Publisher, or a similar type of program if you would like to do so digitally. Or you can use a pen and paper to physically sketch out your spectrum. Now, if you do this, you will need to take a photo of your sketch or scan it and then copy and paste it into your weekly homework document. So just do keep in mind that if you do physically sketch it, there will be an extra step of scanning or taking a photo of it and adding it to your weekly homework document involved. But either way, it's entirely up to you and whatever you find is easiest and most helpful to complete the assignment. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll understand the presence of binary thinking. We'll examine the influences of binary thinking, and we'll explore the existence of a spectrum of perspectives. Keep in mind, this core lecture begins Unit 2, where we want to start examining different points of view, different ways of understanding and approaching the same topic. And so that way we can start to see how different ideas can be put into conversation with one another and how that can lead us to crafting a well-informed and thorough and thoughtful argument. Let's begin our discussion then with really understanding the binary and what I mean by using the term binary. So, I first want to contextualize why we're discussing this. Within the past 5 years, Pew Research has been studying the polarization of culture in the United States, especially. And what proved particularly interesting was that in 2014, they found that American culture or Americans living in the United States um, basically demonstrated a greater need to distance themselves from people who viewed the world differently than they did. So they would say, okay, well, if someone sees this topic or this topic differently than I do, I don't even want to be next door neighbors to them. I don't even want to be around them in any capacity. And there are a number of things that we can credit to that. And there are certainly different explanations that we can offer. But what was really fascinating about the findings is that the respondents really portrayed those who saw the world differently than they did in sort of these pro-con type terms. So they would be very pro themselves and everything else would be con. So when we think about a binary, binaries really represent or really illustrate that there are two ways of going about something. So there are two ways to approach a topic. And so we get all of this pro con, good, bad type speak. And of course, there is a place for that in public discourse. However, there are always more than two sides. What's really tricky with binary thinking and using a binary type approach to either an academic topic or a topic of public interest is that it really limits the dialogue on a particular topic to two perspectives. So let's say I pitch the idea of going and getting some ice cream. I could say, okay, well, we can go out and we can get cookie dough ice cream. What if someone else says, well, no, we can get Rocky Road and I won't hear anything more of cookie dough? Well, okay, if there are a number of us, more than two people in the discussion, and all they're hearing is cookie dough versus Rocky Road, well, someone could say, well, or no, we could all get, mint chocolate chip. Someone says, or we could get Cherry Garcia or another type of flavor. So when we think about a binary, really what that gets at is pretty much saying it's either going to be cookie dough or it's going to be rocky road. There is no in between. There are no other options. And it's completely bypassing and avoiding all other contributions to the discussion. And so I know this seems like a silly way to illustrate what a binary is, but as we will go through and see, this type of thinking has certainly become common in how we understand topics of interest that impact very real publics. So, when we look at binaries in American culture in the United States, okay. So when we look at that, we can see a few very clear examples, but also when we think about it, we can also think of a number of alternatives. So, for example, we've got this photo here in the corner between the red states and the blue states. And when we think about it politically, of course, that is a key example of binary thinking in the United States is that it has to be either Republican or Democrat. But that completely avoids and omits the option that you could identify as a libertarian. You could identify as a member of the Green Party or a Democratic Socialist or, a number of other political parties that exist in the United States. So, again, while we can see the Republican versus Democrat as being representative of the binary, we can also start to understand how just having those two perspectives might limit discussion on certain topics. We also have these two that are sitting diagonal from each other. So we've got close our borders and immigration, it's the American way. So again, when we think about it in that regard, those are two very extreme, and very opposite ways of approaching the topic of immigration. And of course, if we were to engage in a well-rounded discussion, there are a number of options that we could entertain and explore that fall somewhere in between completely closing borders and having completely open borders. It's the same, if we think about abortion as well. So we see at this bottom right photo, keep abortion safe and legal, abortion kills a person. So again, very opposite ways of addressing and discussing the topic of abortion. But again, if we take a step back and we consider the other ways we might look at it, we see that there are certainly more than two approaches to especially complex social topics. All right, so let's discuss unearthing the binary. So if we're going to go beyond the binary, we have to first understand what the binary is. We really have to understand what the pros and cons are that essentially are driving the situation and the discussion on the topic. So, first and foremost, it's important to keep in mind that there are good and bad regardless of the view. So, when we think about it, if we go back here, there are certainly, if you sit down and you talk to someone who is a Republican or a Democrat, you can certainly find both good and bad in their approach to a particular topic. If you talk to someone regarding immigration, there are probably, there's good and there's bad regarding, what they're suggesting. Same with abortion, same with any other type of discussion that affects the public. There are always going to be good bits, well-meaning bits, and then there are also going to be things that we can push back, we can challenge, we can play devil's advocate on and prompt for further inquiry. So first we have to recognize that there are good or bad regardless of the view. It's also imperative to understand the binary extremes. Now, when we think about the extremes, we want to think about polar opposites. Interestingly enough, this can vary from person to person, even if they're looking at the same topic. It really all just depends on how you're approaching the topic. So, for example, I've had students in the past who will look at immigration, and some will look at it in terms of, a business sense. Others will look at it in terms of kind of a cultural assimilation versus acculturation. So there are very different ways that you can go about it. And so, for example, if someone was looking at it from an economic perspective, even though they're looking at immigration, their extremes are just going to be different than someone who is looking at it from more of a social, cultural type sense. So it can vary from person to person based off of how you're looking at a specific topic. But regardless of what topic you're looking at and the exact way you want to approach it, you will identify extremes. So if we go back here, if we look at the immigration example, we've got close our borders or immigration, it's the American way, which we can, at least for the purpose of this lecture, we can assume this is advocating for open borders. So we've got two extremes in terms of how are we going to, as the United States, how are we going to handle the borders? Are we going to close them entirely, or are we going to open them up? And what does that look like? So we very realistically could say that these two could serve as the extremes because they are very much opposite each other, but they are addressing the same issue of how do we handle the borders, and how do we handle entry into the country. So once we have understood and defined those extremes, we can then understand the parameters of which we're working in. And so that way we can develop an appropriate spectrum based off of that. So the final thing that we want to do, like I had just said, is create a spectrum of other existing perspectives. So again, we go back here, we see immigration, it's the American way, close our borders. So closed borders versus open borders. You can't get much more opposite than that. So then we could go back and think about it, is to say, okay, well, what are some alternatives to closed and open borders? So what are some ways that we could approach that? So, we could sit there and say, okay, well, maybe we just increase we increase the presence of agents at all borders, for the United States. Or maybe we, are lax at certain points. So you can see here how those alternatives still fit within those extremes, because it's still, someone could still say, okay, well, I am more of an advocate for open borders, but I still think that we need to at least know, who's coming in and what their business is, regardless of where they're entering the United States, right? And, someone might say, okay, well, I'm more for closed borders, but if we can ensure that people coming in and, at any point in the United States, is a good person, they're not going to break the law, and they're just coming here to contribute, then that's fine, whatever. So you can see again how we are sort of leaning against one of the extremes, but we're not taking such an extreme approach. So that's how we go about creating our perspectives. So as we go through to unearth the binaries, we first, of course, want to define the extreme. So, okay, what are sort of the stopping points that we are going to operate within? Once we've done that, though, we want to explore the ideologies or the belief systems driving those extremes, because that will give us a better sense of who's advocating for them and where exactly, how exactly they're approaching this topic. And then again, that will help us better situate different alternative approaches that we might place on that spectrum. So, when we think about the ideology or the ideological approach here, like I've mentioned, you're probably going to see very much polar opposites. Like we go back to the immigration, closed versus open in terms of borders. Again, you can't get much more opposite than closed versus open. And we'll see the same thing oftentimes with ideology. So, for example, you could see nationalism versus multiculturalism. You could see capitalism versus communism, feminism versus masculinism. So, there are often times with one ideology, there's one that matches up with it well, that represents pretty much the opposite approach. So, if we look at this, no one is illegal. Why put the US in danger? So if we first look at this one, um, they're both concerning refugees. And so if we were to say, okay, we're looking at the topic of refugees and how people approach that topic in regards to accepting refugees either into a country or into a state. So we first see this one, and perhaps this serves as one of our extremes. So no one is illegal, refugees welcome. So, to go back here, we could say this embraces multiculturalism to say we accept people regardless of where they're coming from. If they're in danger, they're certainly welcome here. And we're not going to close any gates or borders, either physical or metaphorical. So we've got one side of the spectrum, and then we have got the opposite side. So why put us in danger? No refugees. And so we could arguably say that this is coming from more of a nationalist perspective to say, okay, well, let's first value and take into consideration the needs and the interests of the people already living here. And then we can go and consider what others and in other parts of the world are going through. But we first need to ensure that the people living here are safe. And so again, we've got two very different approaches to the same topic and the same point of consideration. So while we might see a multiculturalist perspective, we've also got a nationalist perspective, and then that can give us two very opposite extremes that we can sort of function within. Okay, so when we start to see the spectrum, we want to recognize some degree of validity to both extremes. Now, what we're really going to get into with this unit is that opinions, arguments, thoughts, ideas are all grounded in experience of some kind. They, whether it be, something that we ourselves experience, something that we've read, something that we've come into contact with that's changed our way of thinking. And so we first want to be aware of that is that even if it is exact opposite of what we would do, what we would think, what we would say, we do want to be aware of the fact that the perspectives that others are presenting, they're grounded in their own experiences in one way or another. And so it's important to be aware of that before entering into a discussion. It's also important to consider other perspectives in the discussion because that's essentially how you are going to develop your spectrum. So, if you followed the 2016 election or if you're following any parts of the 2020 election, especially as the field with the Democrats starts to narrow, it's really fascinating. Because if you recall back to the 2016 election or think about, what we see with 2020, there are a lot of people who want their party's nomination. Again, we saw that with especially the Republicans in 2016. We're seeing it with the Democrats in 2020. And even on the same topic, they all were pitching very different ways to approach the same problem. So, much like that, we want to consider well, what are the other perspectives in the discussion? If we go beyond the binaries, and if we don't want to think about it in such harsh, black and white, pro, con, good, bad type terms, what does that then make us available to consider? So, if we are not in a position where we can readily think about or readily engage with others who hold different views, then it's kind of us to brainstorm and to think critically and creatively about what are some alternatives to these extremes. Once we do that, once we're able to sort of brainstorm, we want to consider what the alternative perspectives offer that the binaries don't, that the binary extremes don't. So to say, okay, well, if we go back to the open borders versus closed borders example, if we have to say, okay, well, I'm in favor of open borders, so to speak, but we also need to have some kind of accountability system where we can keep up with people who enter the country, and just to make sure that they're contributing, that they have that their needs met, and that they're able to, acculturate in a way that's best for them. Okay, so we could sit there and say, all right, well, open borders, just as an argument, doesn't really have accountability or follow up sort of embedded into it. But this alternative that has a bit more oversight involved does account for that. So is it completely open borders to, completely align with that extreme of the binary? No. But it's still in line with it in certain ways, but allows us to address perhaps other issues that might arise based off of the limitations that the extremes of the binaries offer. Okay, so before I move on to discussing the lecture assignment, I first want to demonstrate how you are going to go about drawing your spectrum. So I'm going to move myself over here. All right, so I am using Word to do this, but like I said, you are more than welcome to use Publisher, Paint, InDesign, Illustrator, another type of software that can allow you to do this. Or you can hand draw it. Really, it is up to you. And I'm not looking for anything super artistic. As you will see, I'm going to do something fairly crude in terms of aesthetics. So first thing that I want to do, I just find this helpful, is I want to change to a landscape orientation that'll allow me to kind of get a longer spectrum and give me more room to work with. So let's say my topic here is, let's say, cost of college, right? So to draw my spectrum, I'm going to come over here to shapes. I'm just going to take a line. Boom. Okay, first step done. Then I'll go ahead and add a couple of text boxes. And I'm going to write in our extremes. So if we think about the topic of the cost of college, there again are a number of ways that we can approach this and a number of ways that we can think about and discuss this topic. But for the sake of this example, let's say free college everywhere for everyone. Okay, so that is one extreme. Oops, okay. There we go. So, and then on the opposite end, so I just copied and pasted my text box. Perhaps the other extreme will be maintain current approach. Let's just say maintain the current approach. So basically how we pay for college right now, namely through loans and scholarships. Okay. So we have got our two extremes of the binary, but we want to start brainstorming some alternatives. So maybe some alternatives could be free community colleges. We could say reduced or locked rates for state institutions. So universities like Dixie State or SUU, Weber State, the University of Utah. So basically everyone who's not Westminster and BYU or a private university like those are. Well, we could also say, better/more opportunities for academic scholarships, increased work-study opportunities. Okay, so when we think about the cost of college and making it more affordable, again, there are certain ways that we can go about approaching this. So we could either take one of the two extremes of the binary to say, okay, just everyone, channeling Oprah, you get free college, you get free college, you get free college. So that might be one extreme that we're dealing with. Whereas the other one could be, okay, let's just maintain the current approach. If a school costs, $30,000, $40,000 in tuition and all that good stuff, then that's whatever, that's on the student, and they can take out as many loans as they'd like. So again, we've got two very opposite ways of approaching the very same topic. But there are some great limitations with both of these extremes. So we've developed alternatives that we can situate on this spectrum. So if we were to say free community colleges, okay, so I'm going to come here. I'm going to create another little notch, but we also want to think, okay, well, where would this fall on the spectrum? This can always this can be a bit tricky, and ultimately it is up to your judgment, how you understand the topic and how you understand the dialogue going on. So let's say, as I see it, I would say free community college falls over closer to free college everywhere for everyone. So I'm going to come here. Oops. I'll try this way. Maybe not. Okay, I'm just going to type it in another text box. And I'll say free community colleges. Okay, so tuition at community colleges are completely taken care of. Okay, so there's one notch. Let's add another one here. So let's see, reduced or lock rates for in-state tuition. So again, it's not free, but it certainly attempts to bring down the cost, or at least make it to where tuition just doesn't randomly spike. So let's say this falls a little closer toward the center here. So okay, so like I had mentioned earlier, this doesn't apply to all colleges, so it is not as extreme as free college everywhere for everyone. But this says, okay, well, if taxpayer money is going to fund this institution, then there should be reduced or locked rates. So again, if we were to look at Utah as an example, Utah State, Weber State, the University of Utah, SLIC, Dixie, SUU, those all would be considered. But if it's a private institution, there's our different alternative. If it's a private institution, maybe they are removed from this alternative. So schools, again, like BYU or Westminster, aren't really factored in because they don't receive taxpayer money. Let's see here. All right, so we're saying here, maintain the current approach. We're moving our way down the spectrum a little bit. So we're right towards the center, but let's say we go a little further down and add in okay, so better or more opportunities for academic scholarships. Okay, so while this doesn't do anything to actively reduce the rates, it still provides students greater opportunities for paying whatever that university happens to be charging. So again, it's not as extreme as maintaining the current approach, but it also isn't, embracing this more free or cost-effective approach that the other side of the spectrum is. So, and finally, I think for increased work study opportunities, I would say that's actually pretty close to this one right here. So it's not as extreme as oops. There we go. We'll just borrow this one. Okay, so it's not as extreme, but we can also see, so increased work study opportunities. Okay, so again, it doesn't do anything to perhaps address the cost of college, and it's not in turn, it doesn't advocate for scholarships, so to speak, but it's saying, okay, well, it's providing students more opportunities to work for that tuition or to work for their education. So this is what I really want you to do with the lecture assignment. This is, pretty much what I'm looking for. So let's return, and this is what a spectrum will look like, a spectrum of perspectives. So we've got our two extremes on either end that really represent that kind of pro-con, black or white type thinking. And then we've developed alternatives that fit within the confines of those extremes and therefore fit within the confines of that conversation. So returning back to the lecture assignment, I want you to identify a problem you're interested in exploring for Project 2. If you haven't read the assignment or the Project 2 assignment sheet, I would encourage you to start off fairly broad. Of course, if you do have a more specific topic in mind, you're welcome to use that. But the point of Project 2 is to start thinking about a topic that you're interested in and can further narrow in Projects 3 and 4. So identify a problem you're interested in exploring for Project 2. So some examples might be just kind of thinking of current events. You could talk about sex education in the public school classroom. You could talk about immigration and the different implications of that. You could talk about the legalization of cannabis or whatever the case may be. So, but that should demonstrate how you want to start off broad, or aim to start off broadly. Based on your current knowledge of that topic or problem, I want you to create a spectrum of solutions to that problem. So, for example, let's say you want to write, or you're interested in exploring why the cost of homes in the Southwest has increased exponentially. Okay, so you say, okay, well, the cost of homes in the Washington County area have skyrocketed. That's a problem. And that can definitely be pitched as a problem. So, based off of your current knowledge of that problem, what would a spectrum of solutions to that problems look like? So, what would the extremes be? So, the extremes could be that, we just let the market do what it does, or, we implement a number of laws and regulations that keeps the housing market affordable in the area. Okay, so we've got two extremes. So what are the alternatives look like? What could some additional solutions be to that problem of the cost of housing going up in the Washington County area? So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to draw again that spectrum of solutions to that problem. Specifically, your spectrum should include two extremes like we saw in the example, and then 2 to 3 additional perspectives that fall somewhere in between those extremes. And again, that really is your judgment in how you see it, and how you want to situate those additional perspectives in regard or in respect to the extremes that you've identified for the topic that you're interested in. All right, so for the weekly homework, you'll want to include your core lecture 7 summary and assignment in your week 4 homework submission. Overall, your week 4 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for core lecture 7 and 8, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And all of that will be due to the appropriate assignment submission folder on Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 15th. If you have any questions or if you'd like to chat about these concepts further, please feel free to message me on Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.